Show. You're now watching the political segment. The topic of discussion is bank charges, fees and interest rates. As we all know, the Central Bank of Nigeria, the CBN, on December 22nd reviewed downwards most charges and fees for banking services as contained in the new guide to charges by banks, other financial and non-bank financial institutions with effect from January 1st, 2020. Joining us to discuss this, we have
with us in the studio Professor Ken Ife, who is a macroeconomic policy analyst and a consultant with the World Bank, ECOWAS, and amongst many others. Welcome to the Weekend Show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's also my pleasure to welcome a good friend, Dr. Nonso Obikili, who is director of the Turgot Center for Economics and Policy Research. Welcome to the Weekend Show.
Happy to be here.
Dr. Nonso, let me start with you. We did a Vox Pop. We carried out a survey on the street to ask Nigerians how many of them were benefiting from this downward review of the bank charges. And some of them brought up the situation where they wouldn't see the debit alert on their phones, but when they go through their bank statements, they'll find out that they were actually debited the old bank charges before the CBN brought this. What can we attribute to that? And in situations where Nigerians have experienced this, what actions can they take?
I think there's always going to be a transition period. When you have a policy-mandated change in fees, then it's going to take a while for banks to readjust their systems to make sure everything goes smoothly. So I'm not surprised to hear that you will find people who still get debited the old charges instead of the new charges. I think the CBN has systems where you can report your bank if something is wrong or if you feel like you've been mistreated in some way. And typically the banks would respond. It might take them a while because, all these things take time. But if they report that, I was charged this instead of this, to the bank, and the bank don't take any action, they can take it to the CBN and then hope to get it escalated. So I think there's lots of avenues for consumers to get some justice.
Professor, so in 2011, we started the cashless policy in Nigeria to get them bank to bank and to push financial inclusion. Just last year, the National Assembly passed the Finance Act for which should come into law this year. And then we saw the CBN memo put out reviewing downwards the bank charges. But if you go through the act and you see most of these changes, it doesn't really have a provision for the unbanked, which is at least 50%, I think even more, of the bankable, 60 of the bankable population. Where is the place for, I want to say the below average Nigerian, but even the average Nigerian in all of this? Because you have some reliefs such as for people and in companies earning less than 25 million, they don't get to pay the same tax as people above. So there are reliefs for people above or from the middle class earning Nigerian. Where's the place of the average everyday Nigerian in all of this?
I think first of all, the only 40% of Nigerians are banked. That's the one major challenge. And within the 5-year plan of Central Bank, they look to move that to about 80% or more. Then secondly, INEC reported that 30% of the country is not covered by broadband. And they can tell that because they're the ones conducting the election. So that tells you another challenge, that we need to incentivize the infrastructure companies to move that coverage. And then we also know for a fact that bank charges are beginning to get under people's skins, and particularly where we have 70% of the revenue of the banks is coming from bank charges, as opposed to 20% in America coming from such charges. So the question is this: how much can the banks invest in widening the participation of most people in the banking sector to enable them diversify their revenue base? That's the key challenge. And we know that is the way to go. But I didn't see much in the finance bill in relation to the key issues you are going to look at, which is about bank charges. But then it did say that for companies, it raised the threshold to 25 million naira tax, the corporation tax for companies earning less than 25 million naira is waived. And that's good, because what it means is that it decreases over 60% of our economy is not actually captured because these are informal traders. So what that has done is to create a pathway for a lot of them to enter the system because And it's not just collecting tax that matters to companies. It's derailing a company because of the process of tax administration. You submit a tax return and they argue with you. They won't give you the clearance. 3 years, you are still arguing. You can't tender again for contract. That is the problem. That's part of the problem. So giving that exemption, and also on VAT exemption as well, it allows inclusion, to widen the inclusion of excluded companies. So a lot of these will come into the, and the GDP figures are going to go up because many of them are transiting into banked and formal sector.
So, Prof, if you were to advise not just the CBN governor, but the government at large on creating more policies and laws to ensure that the banking sector, first of all, we reduce these charges for everyday Nigerians, the 40% who are banked and the remaining 60% who aren't, what advice would you give them? How do they go about doing this?
Given the challenges I've just outlined, CBN is also doing something about infrastructure. She is licensing 3 banking services companies just to increase the asset. But initially, it begins with regulation so that you can protect and encourage those who are... Why do you have to have charges in the first place? There's cost of telecommunication, there's cost of printing currency, there's cost of transporting them, there's cost of replacing them, over $200 million. Then there are costs of... there's so many companies involved. And you have to bring them into the negotiation about reducing. So you begin by placing a cap, that is regulation, and then you come to a point where you now remove your regulation, and then let them compete. Now, the key, and we're going to come there because the movement is coming, but how you do that is, you now say, the CBN says, okay, we now have bank BVN. Since you have BVN, then banks should allow people to transport their accounts. The moment you do this, what it means is that I can walk into the Access Bank and say, look, another bank has offered me free transfers, everything free for the next 3 years. I want you to move all my accounts to GTB Bank. The moment we start doing that, then competition will set in. You will now see banks that will reduce that charge to half or even remove it completely. And that is the point where we should be heading.
So it's
because they have the headroom. If they're making 70% revenue and declaring huge profits, they will see the sense.
Prof,
in lowering charges.
It's interesting you say that, and I'll let you think about it because it makes me question how do startups, small businesses cope. So, for instance, I know some people launched a service which their transfer charges were lower than what the commercial banks had, and then this directive came. And so their unique selling point was kicked out of the window. And so in Nigeria, Ministry of Communication is now Ministry of Communication and Digital Economy. We are talking about banking the unbanked. The finance bill says that you now need a tax identification number to operate an account. So even you, a trader, everybody needs to do that. Coupled with that, we are still in the middle of the argument of stamp duty charges. How does this make sense? Because most people who don't have a tax identification number, personal tax identification number, may not open accounts or be moved to bank their funds anymore. And then with all these extra charges, does it really make sense from an economic angle, Nonso?
Well, the thing is there are conflicting objectives. On the one hand, the CBN wants to get the unbanked into the financial system. There's a debate on whether that's a good thing or not, but that's their objective. And they are trying to make things cheaper. Even for the BVN, they're trying to create a BVN Lite where if you have it, there's a threshold where you don't need to go through the regular KYC process. And I think the TIN thing has also kind of been suspended. So there's a lot of effort to try to get the financial system to be cheaper to get people into the system. Okay. On the other hand, the federal government has a tax revenue imperative, right? We know their budget, we know the revenue problems, and everybody knows getting into the financial system is one step to being taxed, because you can no longer hide money, you can no longer stick between the cracks. And so there are conflicting objectives, right? And people are constantly weighing both sides. I need a bank account, yes, that's true. But if I get a bank account, does that mean FIRS starts coming to my house to look for me, right? And so it depends on, first, what are the benefits of this bank account? What are the charges I have to pay? And on the other hand, what are the odds that if I open a bank account, or if I don't open a bank account, FIRS will still come for me? Right, so those are the conflicting objectives that you kind of see why there's this policy kind of confusion, where one day you're trying to reduce bank charges, another you're adding stamp duty, and it's creating all sorts of conflicting signals. I think for the banking industry, I think the strategy may be wrong because there's this phenomenon that once you set a cap or a price, everybody coalesces around it. So if you say you must charge at most 5 naira per SMS, then everybody just charges 5 naira per SMS. And there's no incentive to compete. New firms who come in to try to break that mold get boxed out of the system because they just end up at 5 naira and there's no incentive. So I think the idea of setting fees for banks itself, I don't think is a very smart idea. I think the focus has to be to reduce costs because there are costs to banking. There are costs to financial services. If you think of SMS alerts, yes, you have to pay 5 naira per SMS, but SMS is not the only way to notify a customer of bank charges, right? We get notification of social media all the time. We don't pay for it. It's just as fast, just as effective as a bank alert. So you need a bit of innovation, a bit of creativity, you need a space for new people to try new ideas. But once you set fees, once you set charges, once you set everything for the entire industry, then there's no incentive for anybody to try something new, right? And that's the problem. So I think that's where the central bank needs to focus on. There's been some new license issued to banks, but we haven't seen any movement on that. There was supposed to be the mobile money banking licenses, well, kind of banking license, but that hasn't kind of like kicked off yet. And so we're seeing all these things that may come on stream, but I hope that the CBN will continue to push into that space.
So if I hear you correctly, a bit of deregulation in terms of these policies where banks need to meet a certain threshold. But I want to know how it's done in more developed societies. For example, Prof reeled out the statistics that only 20% of the revenue generated by banks are from these charges in the Western world. But in Nigeria, it's as high as 75%. That's enormous. So what do we need to do? You've just reeled out some, solutions to that, but what else can we do? How do we take this a step further to ensure that the banks are diversifying their streams of income?
I think deregulation is the wrong word, right? Every industry needs some set of rules. But I think where we need to move towards is transparency. To be honest, if you ask me what my bank charges are today, I have no idea, right? I just see at the end of the month, I see a bunch of fees, and I say, okay, well, it's too late, I've already been charged. Right, so there's no transparency in the financial industry. People don't know exactly what they're getting in. People don't know exactly what their fees are going to be in advance. And because of that, it's difficult to kind of judge which bank is actually better for me, which bank is actually worse. You get promised savings accounts, 10,000 naira, and that's it. And then when you open the account, you find out, oh, well, you have to have a minimum balance of 5,000 naira. Oh, you get charged 100 naira debit fee or something every month. So there's no transparency. And in the US, for example, after the financial crisis, one of the big areas they pushed was transparency. You have to tell your customers exactly what fees they're going to pay. You have to tell them exactly what the rates are. You have to tell them everything so that they can make a decision on which bank to go through, which bank to go to. I think that's what we need to focus on. This idea of setting fees for everybody and everybody just accepting, I don't think it works in terms of trying to move the costs of finance down.
Prof, would you agree that it's a lack of transparency from the bank's part? Because
I'm not sure about that because the CBN specifically provided for banks to negotiate the charges with the customer and places the duty on the bank to inform the customer about that right. So the question is this: how soon will customers collapse into a legal action against the banks and start making claims? So that's something for the future. But what I need to say is that the regulation was the first step from what I said. But they are going to move into a deregulated environment. And then I said that portability of the account is critical because BVN is now in force and TIN is in force. So we have all the provision to now unlock the competitive environment. And that's what is going to drive the cost down. And because we know that there's a big headroom in the banking revenue that they should do that. And of course, you have the fintech you have the mobile money, you have agency. There's so many innovative mechanisms that the CBN is looking at right now, and they're going to kick in. So I've seen these days are gone for the banks to think they can hold us down and do what they want to do. And I tell you, the core issue here is the banks are not being creative in lending to the real sector. And because they are not lending to the real sector, they are not getting the revenue from the real sector. So they now have to rely on bank charges and all of that to squeeze people, and those days are gone. and they're gone fast.
So, Prof, it's interesting you mentioned the mobile money, the mobile agents, and other forms of technology and innovation which should come into banking. But I like that you spoke about at what point will the people file a class action against this bank? Because when they added made bank charges 65 naira, most banks had their cap at 20,000 naira to withdraw money from the ATMs. And so they now reduced it to 10,000 naira, which means if I have to withdraw 20,000 naira, I'm paying about 130 naira.
No.
Now, just a second, Prof. Now, in December, we saw some banks with this new regulation reduce their withdrawal limit, their withdrawal maximum from 10,000 to 5,000 naira. So it's now been reduced to 35 naira, whereas for me to get 10,000 naira, I'm now paying 70 as opposed to 35. And so some banks are being smart about this to still, let me use the word finesse, the customers. What can actually be done? Because this obviously isn't right. And this is for the average Nigerians who want to withdraw 10,000 naira but don't want to spend the extra 70 naira while withdrawing from the ATMs.
I thought that low quantum was to do with accessing, ATM not owned by your primary bank. Because
Yes.
if you are using another bank, then it's 3 times withdrawal, then before the charge kicks in. So if they give you only 10,000 3 times, then if you do it 3 times, then they start charging. So I thought that strategy was more to do with that, rather than your own bank. If you take
so this is with other banks, but considering the landmass, the fact that, so I use a certain bank, but the bank close to my house is a different one. It's still going to cost me money in transportation to go withdraw money, because there are some people I want to pay money and they don't have access to bank accounts, which will become harder now that they need tax identification number, amongst other things, to run bank accounts, because at some point this will be implemented. So it still affects the masses, the everyday Nigerian who needs 6,000 naira to buy foodstuff.
It's a moving target.
And I think we also have to recognize the fact that these people are in the business to make money, right? They are not doing it out of their altruistic nature. They're not doing it as charity work. They do have to make money. But what we're discussing here is the ways in which they go about doing this, So with the using of different, ATMs from different banks, some people might argue in favor of the banks in that condition. But however, I want us to talk about the role of the legislators now, because I was reading an article before we came on air of this gentleman suing his bank for exactly what we're discussing right now. So what is the role of the legislators really in ensuring that each Nigerian gets their, day of reckoning with their banks in case they're doing...
I think CBN has moved to a point of self-regulation, which is an epitome of their degree of independence. And I also see that the customer section, the customer services and customer protection section of CBN is active. It's really sitting on top of these issues. And what I say to them is, let's move to a league table for naming and shaming defaulters. And, so that the moment you begin to have those where you have a league table and some banks see that they are at the bottom and some are at the top, they begin to push these banks because you're actually naming and shaming them.
Yeah.
Quite apart from the impact that the competition will also bring into the whole thing. And I don't think those days are far-fetched.
Stamp duty. Who should bear that cost? Now, Consumer Protection, I think they have a new name, sorry, I've forgotten, but the Consumer Protection Commission issued a release towards the end of last year saying, for instance, filling stations don't have to charge you an extra 50 naira when you are using your cards to make payments. I think CBN is in line with this. But the implication, however, is for smaller businesses, they will now impute that 50 naira in their cost. So there's now inflation, and there's now also the fact that people who want to pay with cash, because the prices have already been increased, they still get to bear the brunt of that. What's your take on this, Nonso?
I think the stamp duty tax is a tax on everybody. For some types of businesses, the business will have to bear the cost because there's no way they can increase their prices to absorb that. For some types of businesses, consumers will have to bear the cost because maybe the businesses have the flexibility to add on charges. So I don't think there's any way anybody can can get around the fact that the taxes will be borne by both consumers and some of the businesses. So when I'm being sharp, for example, adding 15 naira if you want to use your POS, and then if you add the cost of withdrawing through ATMs, then you can avoid it, right? But that's what taxes do, right? Taxes extract money from the system, one way or the other. You can't hide from it, and that's what this stamp duty does. I don't think it's the place of the Competition Commission to say how businesses should deal with that new tax. I don't think that's their role. I think we're in a free society where people are free to adjust prices for most things, and so they should decide if they want to add that tax to the price or not. I think if there is some evidence of people getting together at night and fixing prices, then yeah, they can come and say, well, you can't do this, you have to do it independently. But I think the economy needs to be allowed to absorb the stamp duty tax. I don't think it's a good tax anyway. I think it's a regressive tax because it charges people who are poorer a lot more than people who are richer. If you want to buy fuel of 2,000 naira, you pay 15 naira stamp duty. If you want to buy fuel of 10,000 naira, you still pay the same 15 naira, which means if you're richer, you get a lower percentage of the tax, right? So I don't think it's a very good tax. And I think the disruption it can cause on the economy, given the amount of money that it's going to raise, is not worth it. It will create a lot of disruption, but it's not going to raise that much money anyway. So I think that's one of the taxes that needs to be reviewed, in my opinion. But I think in terms of the transmission of the tax to consumers and to businesses, I think we just have to let it happen. You can't avoid a tax. Right? That's what a tax is.
Gentlemen,
you have to pay.
That's a fine place to leave it. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for watching The Weekend Show. You can watch the entire 4 segments of this program on our website, www.weekendshowng.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Weekend Show NG on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Follow Andy and I at Osasu Igbinedion.
And Andy Madaki on all social media platforms.
All right, helping us to sign out. Take it away.
Lord, you are my rock, my redeemer. Lord, you are my rock, my redeemer. Keep me from willful sins. Lord, you are my rock, my redeemer. Lord, you are my rock, my redeemer. Keep me from willful sins. Everyone is bread, everyone is bread, even those who seem secure. Everyone is bread, everyone is bread, even those who seem secure. Hallelujah. Spark of my life is your hands in my lifetime, oh Lord. In your name my heart lives for joy. Spark of my life is your hands in my lifetime, oh Lord.